Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the ObsPod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter anyone else that's interested, the ObsPod is for you.
Episode 165, Oxytocin Use. Today's episode covers a topic that it suddenly occurred to me might be useful to people working in the maternity space and those using maternity services. And that is the use of oxytocin. And I almost called this episode Use or Abuse because it's a tricky one. The use of oxytocin can be very beneficial in some circumstances, but far less than we probably use it. And therefore I thought I would unpick that a little bit today. The reason I thought about doing this episode is I had a slight epiphany in my last episode when I was talking to Dr. Kirsten Small about intermittent auscultation. Kirsten discussed the fact that we're very good as human beings at telling stories, making up stories that explain the world around us that we don't understand, and then believing those stories and not realising that those are just that, they are stories. So I had a moment of realisation when I was a very junior obstetrician and had just started out in my training. I believed in just that. I believed in a story called Active Management of Labour. And I wasn't the only one that believed in this story. Many, many units believed in this story. And I guess one of the things about having been in a career for 20 or 30 years means that over time it's inevitable that some of the things you did when you were more junior or earlier on in your career become less well accepted practice, because the science, the medicine evolves and you learn and understand. And it may be that I'm just telling myself a series of new stories and that they're no better than the old story. But I thought I would discuss a little bit my thoughts and reflections on my own experience of oxytocin usage. Oxytocin, what is it? I'm going to go right back to the physiology. Oxytocin, we're all familiar with. People often call it the love hormone, which has always seemed to me incredibly strange given its use in obstetrics. But oxytocin is a hormone released from the posterior pituitary gland. So that's an endocrine gland in the brain. The release of oxytocin, naturally, is controlled by nerve impulses that come down from the hypothalamus, down through the nerves to the posterior pituitary. And alongside oxytocin, there is another drug, vasopressin, that is produced from the posterior pituitary, and it's very similar in structure. And I'll come on to why that's important shortly. So oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary gland as the result of nerve stimulation, and that might be from the womb, the uterus, or from the breast, and that's often why people talk about a bit of breast massage or stimulation or expressing milk to help improve oxytocin levels in labour. What the oxytocin does in the womb is has an effect on the receptors in the womb muscle and causes stimulation and contraction. What is the missing bit of the jigsaw is, though, that at some points the womb is completely unresponsive or has very little response to oxytocin, and at some points has lots of receptors. So what happens is that the womb's sensitivity to oxytocin increases towards the end of pregnancy and in labour. So that in early pregnancy, oxytocin has very little effect. The womb is very insensitive. Whereas in labour, and particularly in established labour, the womb is very sensitive. So that very small doses of oxytocin can cause a significant increase in the number, duration and strength of contractions. So in labour, a woman's body will release oxytocin, and as the labour gets going, the contractions will increase, partly due to an increase in the sensitivity of the womb to respond to the oxytocin being released. But the oxytocin does have some downsides too. Remember, I said that structure is very similar to vasopressin, also produced by the posterior pituitary. And because of this, the oxytocin has an effect on the kidneys, which is called antidiuretic, which can lead to water retention in labour. And if you want to know more about that, you can go back to my episode 147 on fluid balance and about water intoxication in pregnancy. So that is oxytocin, naturally produced by the body, by the woman, triggering labour. That's not a problem. And then once she's had her baby, she'll continue to release oxytocin as the baby starts to feed, stimulate the breast, and it's a key hormone in the production of breast milk and breastfeeding. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is the use of oxytocin or syntocinon, synthetic oxytocin, and in some areas of the world it's called Pitocin, by midwives and obstetricians. And this kind of breaks into two parts. If one is having an induction of labour, and I've talked about this also previously on the podcast, we are trying to initiate labour, we will use a combination usually of prostaglandins and oxytocin. So once we have ripened the cervix and hopefully initiated some contractions, we'll then often need oxytocin. The woman is not contracting and we need to give her something to make the womb contract. And whilst we need to be cautious doing that, I don't disagree with that as an approach. What I want to focus on instead is the use of oxytocin or syntocinon in established labour. That is, the woman has come in labour, the labour has started spontaneously, her body's initiated it, and then for some reason, usually the fact that labour is slow, we decide to give her oxytocin. Maybe the contractions have spaced out, or maybe the progress, the dilatation and descent of the head is slow, and we want to give her oxytocin. And this is where active management of labour comes in. And this is a story that I very much subscribe to for a significant part of my career. The idea that if a woman was progressing slowly, that if we gave her oxytocin judiciously, carefully, at the right moment, we might change the outcome of that labour. So we might have a woman who was, in our minds, heading for a potential caesarean birth because of very slow progress in labour or a stalled labour. And we would give oxytocin and we would congratulate ourselves that we potentially corrected her labour and managed to avoid her having a caesarean birth. And it's tricky for me to make this podcast and admit that this is something I very much subscribe to. I used to get irritated when I came onto the labour ward and took over and discovered a woman that had been languishing in labour for a very long period of time, and people hadn't acted. They hadn't performed an amniotomy, that is breaking the waters. They hadn't given her syntocinon, and therefore I felt that I was being left with a situation which was beyond rescue. She was now in a situation where she was inevitably going to need a caesarean birth. And that very much comes back to the way we're taught about the mechanics of labour, the power, the passage, the passenger. And therefore, one of the things I could adjust was the power of contractions by prescribing syntocinon. And it seemed to me bad obstetrics, bad medicine, if I didn't give the woman the drug that I felt could make a difference. Let's take a step back and think, where did this story come from? Well, it came from Ireland. In the 1960s and 1970s in Dublin, an obstetrician, O'Driscoll, introduced active management of labour, and that was once a woman was diagnosed as being in established labour, they had their waters broken, and if they were dilating at less than 1 centimetre per hour, they were given synthetic oxytocin to correct their labour. And I'm not kidding, that was the language used, correct their labour. These are women in spontaneous labour. And in the early work that was published, around 55% of first-time mothers were given oxytocin during their labour. That's a phenomenally high number. Remember, these are not women that are being induced. These are women who've come in labour. So effectively we're saying more than 50% of women, their body doesn't know how to labour. And when you look back at that evidence, this led to a quicker turnover of women through their labour ward. The labour was faster. They were aiming for a woman's labour to be less than 12 hours. That means you can maximise the efficiency of your labour ward, because the quicker women give birth, the quicker the midwife can look after the next woman, and the quicker a room becomes available to do so. And therefore, women potentially might like it because the labour is shorter, and the staff like it because there's more efficiency and flow through the unit. And if you look back at that work, it does say that. But somehow, a bit like Chinese whispers, that story gets changed into, oh, they actually improved the outcome of those women, because they tied it into the rate of caesarean birth. Now, I started my career in 1994. That's when I started in obstetrics. And to some degree, it's not my fault that these were the stories I believed, because at that time, this was very much in vogue. We drew lines on the partogram, action lines, and to think about this topic today, I've gone back through my training portfolio where I've got audits that I've done to look at whether midwives were following the guidance and following those action lines and appropriately requesting the doctors review and start syntocinon if a woman's progress was slow. People were dealing with rising caesarean rates across the Western world, and people were looking for a way to reduce that, seeing that as a bad thing. And I know that's a controversial statement in itself these days, but unless a woman wants a caesarean, we should be keeping a caesarean to a minimum. It is major surgery. It's not how the body was designed to give birth. So people were looking around to try and reduce the rising caesarean rate. But looking at and thinking about this topic for today's episode, I quickly discovered some papers published in 1996, so only a couple of years after I got started in obstetrics, that clearly demonstrated that the early use of amniotomy and oxytocin versus using it later in labour didn't make any difference to outcomes. So it did not have an effect on the caesarean section rate. And that more important were things that we take for granted now, such as one-to-one midwifery care and support in labour, rather than the oxytocin itself. I am interested that this study compared early use of oxytocin with selective use, rather than with no use of oxytocin at all. And that in itself, to me, shows part of the mindset of the time in which we were practicing. So when I reflect, I'm thinking, why has it taken me a really, really long time to lose that firm belief that using syntocinon would reduce the chance of caesarean birth? And you might think that on the labour ward, you would see that you'd see it didn't make any difference, and therefore you would quickly change your beliefs. But actually the opposite is true. You would see women that you'd given syntocinon to have a vaginal birth, and rather than realising that actually given time they probably would have had a vaginal birth anyway, you would think, aha, that's because I corrected her labour, I gave her oxytocin, and now she's had a vaginal birth. Fantastic result. I did the right thing. And I guess some of that is confirmation bias, isn't it? And it's not realising that actually, left to her own devices, that woman would have had a vaginal birth anyway. The other thing that I believed was that if there was a malposition, so the baby was back to back, that using oxytocin might help the rotation of that baby. It might help with more effective, more powerful contractions that would help the baby with its rotation and therefore help correct that. And maybe that was going to be how I was going to avoid a caesarean birth. And alongside this, we had the story that oxytocin was a bad thing. So giving syntocinon could cause fetal distress. And that was very real. We did know that. But equally, I remember once arguing with a professor about this because he was saying if there was fetal distress, one needed to turn off the oxytocin and give the baby a break. Whereas I was thinking if I turned off the oxytocin and gave the baby a break, great, but that baby would never be born unless I did a caesarean. So I wanted to use the oxytocin, but use it carefully. Let's think about what's the downside of oxytocin. Well, it can cause hyperstimulation. So too many contractions, one on top of the other, because you're overstimulating the womb. And that can cause fetal distress. So it can cause decelerations in the baby's heartbeat. And in that situation, we need to stop the oxytocin. It can mean the woman has what we call no resting tone, so the womb doesn't properly relax between contractions. Or she can be having contractions maybe more than 5 in 10 minutes, so that she and the baby don't get any respite, any breathing space in between. Therefore, we have to use oxytocin, syntocinon extremely carefully. And we have to consider, is this baby fit and able to cope with the use of oxytocin? And these days in my unit, we talk a lot about, is this baby fit for labour when we're thinking about birth? And sometimes we do a caesarean because this baby isn't going to be able to cope with oxytocin in an induction process. And of course, the downsides aren't all for the baby. There are downsides for the woman. Not only could she experience considerable pain if she's hyperstimulated, although often women with oxytocin will choose an epidural, partly for the reason that they feel the contractions are more intense because we're forcing her body to do something that it's not naturally generating and pacing. But also, if we have a woman on oxytocin for a long period of time, then those oxytocin receptors potentially get saturated. And when we want the womb to contract after she's had her baby, say we've ended up doing the inevitable caesarean, or she has given birth vaginally, the womb has then been flogged and she's more likely to have a postpartum hemorrhage. There's plenty of evidence of this when I've done reviews of cases where a woman's hemorrhaged, and also plenty of evidence about poor use of syntocinon causing fetal distress and, worst case, long-term harm to the baby. If you look at medico-legal statistics and all the initiatives looking at improving outcomes for babies and reducing hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, HIE, syntocinon is ever present as a considerable risk factor. And that's why I was thinking about calling this episode Use and Abuse. So is there ever a situation in which we should be using syntocinon in spontaneous labour? And there probably is, but I now use it far less than I ever did. If you look at the NICE guidance, it clearly says that if a woman is beyond 5 centimetres dilated, so she's in her well-established spontaneous labour, that there is no benefit to using syntocinon in terms of the outcome of caesarean or vaginal birth, but that it may speed up her labour, shorten it by up to 2 hours. And these days in my unit, partly thanks to Susanna Pereira, who has now left us, but did an enormous amount of work on fetal monitoring in labour, we really stopped using syntocinon in spontaneous labour, so that we use it hardly at all, particularly if a woman is in the latter stages of labour, maybe 7 centimetres or beyond. And we think instead about the position of the baby, what we can do naturally, such as breast stimulation or biomechanics, because if her body isn't progressing to a vaginal birth, then all we're doing by adding syntocinon is increasing the risks for both her risk of bleeding and her baby's risk of distress and injury. And we're potentially using those very strong, powerful contractions to wedge the baby into the pelvis in a way that it isn't progressively descending and rotating and doing all the things we need it to do. It's just impacting it. And this is a very real negative consequence of the action we're taking. And you can see this in the fact that we now have algorithms and guidance on how to manage an impacted fetal head at caesarean, and that this incidence is increasing. And one of the associations with this situation is augmentation and use of syntocinon. The other very real complication associated with syntocinon in this obstructive situation is that of uterine rupture. And we often think of the womb rupturing in women that have had a previous caesarean birth, a rupture along the caesarean scar. And it's true that that increases with the use of syntocinon. But equally, if one has a woman who's had babies before, multiparous woman, and we use syntocinon in a situation where her labour is obstructed, she can rupture her uterus, which is extremely dangerous for both her and her baby. Rupture is not something we see in women having their first baby, but is a very real factor that we need to consider extremely carefully when we're considering the use of syntocinon in these specific situations. And we really do need to proceed with caution, but also having fully explained to the woman the pros and cons, so that she can make her own individual, well-informed decision about whether to proceed. So we need to be even more reluctant to use syntocinon in multiparous women. Let's go back to think about those first-time mums who've come in spontaneous labour, who I may or may not be thinking should have syntocinon. What am I considering before I take the decision or make a recommendation to them? So if I'm going to use syntocinon in this situation, we need to do a very careful vaginal examination to see, are there any signs of any obstruction, any soft tissue swelling, caput on the baby's head, any moulding, any malposition, any suggestion that this labour is obstructed. What's her urine like? Is it blood stained? How is she coping, and how frequent are the contractions? And maybe if all those things are okay, and maybe her contractions are quite spaced out, maybe once in every 10 minutes. And once we've had a really good conversation with her about, actually, this might help. It probably won't change the outcome in terms of whether you have a caesarean or a vaginal birth, but it may make things a bit quicker, may make your labour a bit shorter, reaching that inevitable outcome. Would you like to try it? So we need to have a good conversation with women in labour if we're going to use it. And that in itself is difficult unless she's already chosen an epidural. Because having a conversation with a woman about this when she's contracting strongly and considering that to be informed consent can be really tough. And actually, women are in some ways a lot more sensible than us. So a lot of women have done some antenatal classes. A lot of women are frightened or scared of our Oxytocin on drip. A lot of women are reluctant to have the drip. I see this quite a lot, even in induction of labour. And they don't want it. They will decline it. And that's okay. That's informed consent. It is much harder when you're having an induction. With an induction, it's highly likely, having your first baby, that you will require some syntocinon to get your labour started. Not all the time. Sometimes prostaglandins will be sufficient, but it's much more likely that we will need it. But then again, what will often happen is we'll start it, your body will start responding, and then your body will take over. We will often then be able to turn the syntocinon down, reduce the dose, and turn it off. The final thing I want to talk about is when we do have that hyperstimulation with syntocinon, what do we do? Well, we turn it off and we wait. We wait and see how the baby recovers and how the contractions space out. But what do we then do? Do we turn it back on? And I'd like you to have a little look at a new intrapartum care evidence review that was just published at the end of last year. And that is around the use of restarting oxytocin once hyperstimulation has happened, and what dose it should be restarted and after what time period. And the answer is that, having examined all the evidence, that there's no consensus. In this review, they have decided that the recommendation should be contracting every 3 to 4 times in 10 minutes. And if there are more than 4 contractions in 10 minutes, oxytocin should be reduced or stopped. And that's a new thing because the NICE guidance used to say 4 to 5 in 10 minutes. So that's a significant change. They acknowledge the fact that oxytocin is a very powerful drug and has an increased risk of adverse outcomes. But they didn't find any kind of agreement as to what dose it should be restarted and timing. So they did agree that the general consensus of restarting it after 30 minutes is likely to be okay, but again, no firm evidence. And they emphasised a lot the need for an obstetrician and midwife to look at the whole clinical picture and also take into account the woman's wishes, because to have people rush in, turn off your drip, and then half an hour later tell you they want to turn it on despite whatever adverse event has just happened to your baby is extremely anxiety provoking and worrying. So my zesty bit is, remember, this is an extraordinarily powerful drug that we sometimes give out almost like Smarties on the labour ward. And really, for a drug that is in use in every labour ward in the country, it is quite shocking that we have so little evidence. Remember that it won't change the outcome in terms of mode of birth. So whether you're going to have a vaginal birth or caesarean, it won't make a difference, but it may make a difference to the speed of your labour. But also it can have a significant negative impact. So try and think about using oxytocin mainly as an induction medication rather than for use in spontaneous labour. And when and if you do use it in spontaneous labour, you've got to be extremely cautious and really careful. And if you're a pregnant woman listening to this, then don't be afraid of syntocinon, because it isn't the drug itself, it's the way we're using it. So when people talk to you about the use of syntocinon, the key thing to keep in your mind is, did you go into labour naturally or not? If you went into labour naturally, it's unlikely that you should need syntocinon, and it's not going to make a difference to which way your baby is born. Whereas if you're having an induction, it's much more likely that it will be of some benefit. So I hope that's not been too much rambling. I hope that's been useful, my thoughts on the use of syntocinon. And I'd love to know other people's thoughts and opinions, because I still think we're wedded to that story, that it makes a difference. Thanks for listening.
I very much hope you found this episode of the ObsPod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the ObsPod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at the ObsPod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can email me theobspod@gmail.com. Finally, it's very important to me to keep the ObsPod free and accessible to as many people as possible. But it does cost me a very small amount to keep it going and keep it live on the internet. So if you've enjoyed my episodes and by chance you do have a tiny bit to spare, you can now contribute to keep the podcast going and keep it free via my link to buy me a coffee. Don't feel under any obligation, but if you'd like to contribute, you now can. Thank you for listening.